You are what you eat, goes the old saying. So what is Chicago?
It's I wouldn't say a melting pot. How about a cultural stew?
Yeah, a big stew pot.
Big stew pot with lots of different flavors in it.
I'm Geoffrey Baer, and in this show, I'll be eating my way through Chicago history.
From the Native Americans who ate a wild onion they called chicagui.
And also there is buffalo meat in here.
Buffalo meat.
To the Italians who created foods that are unique to Chicago.
19 different herbs and spices, 7 more than the Colonel.
From African Americans who brought rich culinary traditions up from the South.
Oh, that's barbecue. That's real barbecue.
To Chicago's more recent waves of immigrants who've given our city a Latin flavor.
If I get the right kind of tortilla, if I get the right kind of chile, I'm happy.
From Chicago's fast food favorites to its historic candy industry. From the Greeks to the Poles. We'll remember the Stockyards and sample foods that immigrants brought from China, Germany, Ireland, South Asia, and the Middle East. In this show, we'll get to know the people of our city through the food on their plates.
There's nothing like sitting down to dinner with somebody to get to know them.
These are the foods of Chicago.
Cheers to us.
One taco?
The Maxwell Street Market. My eyes tell me I'm just a few blocks from Sears Tower. But my taste buds are telling me I'm in Mexico.
Now, you see that place? Well, they have huaraches, which means sandals.
I've come here with culinary historian Bruce Craig to get a taste of this historic market.
So this really looks like the kind of place you'd find in Mexico, yeah?
Yeah, it does. You can shop and then eat, then shop, then eat
some more.
But Mexicans are just the latest wave of immigrants to bring their favorite foods to this market. 100 years ago, and 5 blocks away, the old Maxwell Street Market had a European flavor. This is where Jewish immigrants created the all-beef Chicago hot dog. And Germans, Italians, and Greeks all added their own toppings. On Maxwell Street, a Macedonian popularized a Polish sausage sandwich, while nearby, Italians invented a whole new kind of beef sandwich. Later, African Americans brought fish sandwiches and blues music. It's been called the Ellis Island of the Midwest, and with good reason. On Maxwell Street, there's been a blending of flavors and cultures that could be found in few other places on our planet.
So it's a compressed version of the American story. I wouldn't say a melting pot. How about a cultural stew?
Yeah, big stew pot.
Big stew pot.
That stew pot is much bigger than Maxwell Street. Chicago as a whole is a place where you can sample foods from every corner of the earth without ever getting on a plane.
It's quintessentially American. America is a country of immigrants. And they've all brought their cultures with them.
Oh, good.
There it is. This is what the local Native Americans called chicagui. That's right, many believe that this is what Chicago is named for. It's one of several kinds of fragrant onions and garlic that would have perfumed the air here, adding a little spice to the Native Americans' lives.
Among the Ojibwe people, that was as spicy as it got.
Okay.
Doreen Weesey is Ojibwe Indian. Her ancestors would have been eating those wild onions 2 centuries ago. Doreen and her colleague Zeke met me here at North Park Village Nature Center to cook the kind of meal their ancestors might have made.
We have a great corn soup, and also there is buffalo meat in here.
Buffalo meat.
Buffalo meat, yeah.
And what's this dish here?
This dish is one of my favorites. It's wild rice. Also in this, we have some beans. Many, many tribes planted 3 vegetables: corn, beans, and squash.
And you call this?
The 3 sisters. Everything we did involved prayer. We would not pick a plant, we would not kill an animal until we gave Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for us was every day.
Let's eat.
Okay, let's eat. According to an old Lebanese tradition, if a piece of pita bread falls to the floor, you pick it up and kiss it.
That's a way of capturing just how very precious that relationship is between the person and the food and the respect for the food.
The people of the Middle East have rich culinary traditions that many of us in the Midwest have embraced. With Middle Eastern communities thriving in places like Bridgeview and Albany Park, the vocabulary of your average Chicagoan now includes words like falafel, tabbouleh, and of course, pita. Al Khayyam Bakery in Albany Park supplies many Chicago restaurants with their daily bread. The pita is made here in a contraption designed by owner George Munsef. He had it built in Lebanon and shipped to Chicago. The flattened dough winds its way on a conveyor belt for half an hour so it relaxes, before passing quickly through a very hot oven, which makes each piece balloon to form a pocket.
Every bite at the Lebanese table is brought from the plate to the mouth with a piece of bread.
Now, even the salad, would you wrap that in the bread?
Yes.
Really?
Al Khayyam also makes this paper-thin bread called lavash. The fragile dough is stretched on a pillow to prevent it from tearing. Then it's cooked on a domed griddle called a saj. In neighborhoods like this one with significant Muslim populations, you'll often see signs for halal butchers. Halal means it's permitted under Islamic law. Halal meats must be zabiha, meaning that the animal was slaughtered according to Islamic law. Of course, there was a time when it wasn't so easy for Middle Eastern immigrants, whether Muslim or Christian, to find the ingredients they needed in Chicago. Some took a do-it-yourself approach.
I remember my mother loved to drive, but nothing would get her to stop except one thing. When she'd pass a grapevine, she'd hit that brake so hard all the kids would go flying over the back seat. She'd walk us out, open the trunk, and pull out the plastic bags, and we'd strip every leaf off the grapevine in less than 5 minutes.
When Ray Hananiah's family immigrated to Chicago in 1926, there was already a thriving Arab community here. So many had landed at the corner of Michigan Avenue and 18th Street, it's been called the Plymouth Rock for Chicago's Arabs.
Some of the books that were published at the time cautioned people not to go there, that this is Arabian Row.
Many of them had a knack for entrepreneurship. By the early 1970s, Palestinians owned 20% of the grocery and liquor stores citywide. Others opened restaurants, like Steve's Shish Kebab in Palos Hills, which started out on Chicago's southwest side in the 1970s. It was foods like kebabs and shawarma that helped these restaurants catch on in meat-loving Chicago.
That then drew people into other Arabian restaurants to taste the wider menu. Hummus, the couscous.
Today, there's a vast selection of Middle Eastern foods in Chicago. It's a reflection of the size and diversity of the Arab American community here, which now numbers about 150,000.
This is Palestinian tabbouleh because I can tell because it has cucumbers. If you go to a Lebanese restaurant, they don't use cucumbers. They use a lot of parsley. But that's how you tell what country the cook is from. When they smile, if their teeth are just completely covered with parsley, you know they're Lebanese.
These foods offer a window into the cultures of the Middle East, at a time when so many Americans are trying to better understand that part of the world.
If you get to know the food, you fall in love with the food, you can easily fall in love with the people. You take them off the front page of a Chicago newspaper or off of CNN or the TV news, you put them on a table around food, and suddenly they look like everybody else. Breaking bread.
Breaking bread, okay. All right, thank you.
There you go.
Steve Schappetti knows meat. His family owns Schappetti Lamb and Veal. It's the last slaughterhouse left at the site of Chicago's Union Stockyards. But Steve decided he'd rather cook meat for a living and leave the slaughtering to someone else.
It was so much more romantic and so much more sexy to see that part of the business than to see what I was doing in the slaughterhouses.
In its heyday, 13 million animals were slaughtered at Chicago's Union Stockyards every year. That was 80% of America's meat. And that had a big effect on how we ate here in Chicago. Having this huge supply of meat in our backyard, steaks were cheap and plentiful, and the steakhouse became a Chicago institution.
It's like going to an East Coast and going fishing. Obviously, when I go to get lobster, I'm expecting that it's going to be the freshest lobster available.
Oh boy.
And the same thing with meat.
Chicago steakhouses developed a distinctive flavor, which you can still sample at places like Gibson's.
It's simplicity. It's not overdone. It's not a frou-frou concept where we have things spinning on walls, and it's all about that. It's basically, you know what, I'm coming here for the food. I know I'm coming for the food. It's clean white tablecloth. Waiters, the male waiters, coming out wearing the big burly and the bow tie and the clean white shirt.
There's a secret to making a great Chicago steak. It's in the way it's aged. Aging the meat makes it tender and flavorful, though the process itself isn't so mouth-watering.
Aging really is controlled rotting. You get an intense flavor by the enzymes naturally breaking down the piece of meat.
The old-fashioned way of doing it is called dry aging.
We put this into our refrigerated cabinet. We set up salt in the bottom of the cabinet so it helps keep the moisture in control. And we'll keep this going anywhere from up to 7 to 28 days.
I don't know, there's something about the way you just did that that really clues me in that you're a guy who's from 4 generations of butchers.
Well, I don't know about that, but, you know, I like to keep it simple and clean.
The Union Stockyards closed in 1971. But one pig product is still processed on that historic site in numbers that rival the old days. Evans Foods makes 37% of the world's pork rinds. Every year, the skins from 60 million hogs enter this plant. They're made into these pellets, which are then popped like popcorn. Evans Foods exports much of their product to Mexico, where pork skins are popular. The faithful never go home hungry from the True World Outreach Church in Austin.
The Bible says that Jesus' hands are stretched out all the day long.
Every Sunday, Pastor Banks feeds their souls, while back in the church's kitchen,
little Cajun season,
Mrs. Banks gets ready to feed their stomachs with soul food.
I'm going to put green onions, green peppers, yellow peppers. I'm using white pepper and a little chicken season. Sweet pickle relish. I'm going to fry it on top of the stove.
This is looking very tasty. I'm going to have to put it in my own recipe book.
Today, Mrs. Banks is getting a hand from Wilbert Jones.
You're eyeing it all, huh?
He's a food scientist who writes cookbooks.
A little dab of that.
But for Mrs. Banks, cooking is more art than science.
I like to experiment.
You do?
I love to cook, but I don't like to eat.
You love to... I'm the opposite. I like to eat, but I like to cook.
Today, she's making smothered cabbage.
Very, very indigenous to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia.
A string bean dish.
And I'm seeing Deep South all over this particular recipe.
Smothered chicken.
Alabama, it could be a possibility, or either pockets of Mississippi.
And for dessert, peach cobbler.
This is a standard Southern cobbler.
It's no accident that all these dishes come from the Deep South.
Our roots are both from Mississippi, Mrs. Banks and mine.
Historically, many of Chicago's African Americans came up here on the Illinois Central Railroad, which passed through states like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. More than 500,000 migrated north to Chicago between 1916 and 1970 in what's been called the Great Migration. And they brought with them centuries-old culinary traditions that were born out of slavery.
Soul food is the kind of food that makes do with what's left over. If you were a slave Your weekly ration was maybe 4 pounds of salted meat, and maybe some cornmeal, and maybe some blackstrap molasses.
A lot of pork pieces, a lot of wild greens and things of that nature. Looking at leftover ingredients that were available and taking those ingredients and making something fantastic from it.
Sometimes by frying the food. These are hoe cakes, which are essentially fried cornbread batter. It's believed that field hands used to cook these on shovels and hoes.
Making smothered chicken, Southern style.
Another popular technique is smothering.
I'm going to put a gravy on it.
It makes a tougher cut of meat tender and tasty.
Basically taking something like chicken, adding a little bit of water to it, and covering it up, and actually let the chicken juices smother it out.
In the South, this cuisine was often known as country cooking. But during the 1960s, when the term soul was being used to describe African-American music and culture, it became soul food.
It has to do with the essence of what it is that makes African Americans distinct. And it's very important to a lot of us that we teach our children those distinctions. You are doing such a good job.
Okra.
Donna Pierce is over at her sister's house, sharing a family recipe with her niece, Alexis.
Well, I'm making gumbo, and this is our family dish.
Their family comes from Mobile, Alabama, on the Gulf Coast.
Mobile gumbo has tomatoes, and New Orleans gumbo does not.
Chicago has always had a strong cultural connection to that part of the country, going all the way back to the days when Louis Armstrong brought jazz up from New Orleans. Others brought Creole cooking.
Creole food is a blend of French and Spanish, African. The African culture I find to be the most pronounced.
There are many aspects of African American cuisines that can be traced back to Africa. The word gumbo actually comes from an African Bantu word for okra.
Slaves were very valuable, and they wanted to keep them alive and keep them fed, so they brought over their native crops to feed them.
I did it again.
Okay. When the Africans were brought over, so much was lost of religion and language and so much else. And one of the things that we do have is food. And that's why this is so important to me.
Chicago didn't turn out to be the promised land for everyone who made the journey north. Restrictive housing covenants confined African Americans to a section of the South Side known as the Black Belt.
African Americans were largely excluded from downtown. You can find African Americans even today who've never actually been downtown. It's amazing.
Instead, they started their own business districts with their own restaurants on a section of South State Street that was known as the Stroll, and later on 47th Street.
This is the entrepreneurial capital of Black America.
To this day, Cook County has more black-owned businesses than any other county in America. Harold's Chicken Shack had 65 locations as of 2007 and counting. Harold Pierce opened the original at 47th and Greenwood in 1950. That's 5 years before McDonald's started franchising, 2 years before KFC. Now there are stores as far away as Atlanta. There are several classic Chicago soul food restaurants that have been around for decades. The oldest is Army and Lou's. It opened in 1945 at 39th and Indiana. Army and Lou's has been here on 75th Street since the 1960s. Another tradition that African Americans brought north with them to Chicago was barbecue.
Barbecue in the South is really, really good.
Robert Adams at Honey One Barbecue on the north side insists on doing it here in the same way he did it down in Arkansas, over wood.
Why do you like the wood?
Oh, that's barbecue. That's Arkansas. That's real barbecue. You know what I'm saying?
In the South, they often barbecued outside on old oil drums. But the classic Chicago barbecue joints like Honey One use these so-called aquarium smokers.
It holds the heat. And it actually makes it tender, too. The key to barbecue is cooking it slow.
And why? What's that do?
It makes it tender. If you cook it fast, it's hard.
But the only problem with taking this outdoor cooking method and bringing it into the kitchen is that it gets hot in here.
This is unbelievable. When you open up that thing, the blast of heat that comes out here, it's hot in here, isn't it?
Yeah, but it reminds me of home.
Yeah.
The South, which is very hot.
Chicago barbecue places typically use a more tart, vinegary sauce, but here it's sweeter. His secret?
Honey.
Honey.
There's honey in it.
And it wouldn't be Chicago barbecue without the ubiquitous piece of white bread on top. Now, what's with the piece of white bread on the top?
Oh, my goodness. That's the secret of barbecue.
Yeah?
Back in the old days, that's all we had was white bread.
So, slow cooking, how many hours a day are you standing here cooking?
I comes in about 5:30, 6 o'clock a.m., and I cooks to the afternoon. But I love it, though.
Yeah.
When you love doing something, you never get tired.
Yeah. Coming up, Chicago's famous food factories and Irish, Jewish, Chinese, and Greek food. Take a close look around your kitchen sometime. You might be surprised to discover how many of the foods that you eat every day were made in and around Chicago. Chicago was built in the middle of the Midwest, a region that churned out a steady supply of corn, grains, beef, and dairy. So it had all the right ingredients to become a food manufacturing hub, and it had the means to ship this food all over the country. The Illinois and Michigan Canal, and later the railroads, made Chicago a transportation center. 3 oat milling companies merged in Chicago to start the Quaker Oats Company in 1901, though none of the founders were actual Quakers. They chose the name because Quakers were known as honest businessmen. Their logo didn't depict an actual Quaker either. The model was Chicago actor and radio host John C. Burns. 2 Chicago lawyers created the National Biscuit Company in 1898. The name was later shortened to Nabisco. Biscuit was another word for cracker back then. They were usually sold in barrels at grocery stores. Nabisco's old plant on Chicago's southwest side still makes Ritz crackers, Fig Newtons, and Oreos. A rival cracker maker, the United Biscuit Company, set up shop in Chicago in 1927. They later moved to Elmhurst and renamed the company Keebler, after Godfrey Keebler, who founded one of their subsidiaries.
We do it magically.
And for the record, he was not an elf. The elves were the creation of Chicago ad agency Leo Burnett. Morton Salt was founded here way back in 1848. The company's biggest innovation was a kind of salt that doesn't clump when it gets damp. Hence the slogan, "When it rains, it pours," illustrated by the famous Umbrella Girl. A Canadian immigrant named J.L. Kraft got his start wholesaling cheese from a horse-drawn wagon in Chicago. Kraft's big breakthrough came in 1915 when he found a way to give cheese a longer shelf life by heating it up and stirring it. Today, Kraft is based in Northfield, Illinois. A milkshake machine salesman from Oak Park named Ray Kroc spent a lot of time at Chicago hot dog stands. He carefully observed their fast food business model and thought he might be able to apply it to hamburgers. On a sales call to San Bernardino, California, Kroc saw potential in a busy hamburger stand run by brothers Mac and Dick McDonald. He convinced them to take him on as a franchise agent. Ray Kroc built the first McDonald's franchise here in Des Plaines, Illinois in 1955. By 1961, he had opened more than 200 restaurants and bought out the brothers for $2.7 million. Today, the company's based in west suburban Oak Brook. McDonald's comes out of a long and rich Chicago fast food tradition.
Cafeteria is a Chicago invention. Well, not
the cafeteria? Really?
Yeah, really.
It turns out the cafeteria was the brainchild of John Kruger, a Swedish immigrant who based his self-service restaurant concept on the smorgasbord. On a trip to Cuba, he discovered the Spanish word for coffee shop, cafeteria.
And he said, boy, that's a really good name. So he came back and he said, I'm going to call my places cafeterias.
These places were especially popular with women who weren't always welcome at lunchrooms or saloons. It seems Al Capone was something of a snack food junkie. In fact, he had his own supplier. Leonard Japp got his start selling pretzels and nuts to Capone's speakeasies in 1927. About a year later, Capone was vacationing in Saratoga Springs, New York, when he discovered a new snack that had been invented there, the potato chip. Capone returned to Chicago with marching orders for Leonard Japp.
He basically told my grandfather that, he would like to see these snacks called potato chips in the speakeasies, and he really loved them. And at that point, so my grandfather basically got in the potato chip business.
And so, in the mid-30s, Chicagoans were introduced to Mrs. Japs, a revolutionary new kind of potato chip. While others made thick chips that were fried in lard, these were thin and light and fried in corn oil. But Leonard Japp's brand name became a pejorative term in December of 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Sales of Mrs. Japs plummeted.
I think people thought there was a little Japanese lady cooking potato chips.
As you may have guessed by now, he changed the brand name to Jay's. Today, Jay's Southside Potato Chip Factory is one of the largest in America.
Corned beef and cabbage. It's what people think of as the quintessential Irish dish. Except the funny thing is, it's not Irish.
Corned beef is an American dish, and it's good.
But it's not
But it's not Irish. It's not as good as this.
This is boiling bacon, what immigrants like Maureen O'Looney ate back in Ireland.
Bacon, a piece of a pig.
Maureen and her friends met me at the Irish American Heritage Center to cook for me the kind of meal they ate growing up.
Where would you get your bacon from in Ireland?
From a pig, an Irish pig.
From your own pig?
My own pig, yeah.
Like many Irish immigrants who came to Chicago, Maureen grew up in the Irish countryside, where almost everything she ate came right from her own backyard.
Cabbage and turnips and carrots and parsnips. See, it's all wholesome food that grows in the garden, grows there, and it's wholesome.
Of course, it wouldn't be an Irish meal without potatoes. Maureen cooks them separately from the rest of the food to make sure the spuds keep their flavor.
You see how they're smiling? We call that smiling now. Laughing because it opened out.
Now, what makes a particularly good potato?
What makes a good potato?
Yeah, what
it's
makes
grown
it
in
taste
good Irish soil. That's where you get that.
In Ireland, peasants practically lived on potatoes, and it proved tragic in 1845.
Oh, man.
An airborne fungus wiped out the country's potato crops. Nearly 1 million people died, and another 1.5 million fled. Many landed in Chicago. Irish immigrants had initially come here for jobs digging the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which linked the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. Later, they served as unskilled laborers in places like the steel mills, railroads, and stockyards. No one is quite sure how corned beef became popular with Irish Americans. One theory is that it goes back to New York's Lower East Side, where the Irish visited Jewish butchers who brought the food from Eastern Europe.
Is there any corn in corned beef? Why is it called corned beef?
Winston Sausage on the southwest side has been making corned beef since 1960.
In the old days, they used to use salt about the size of corn, and that would preserve it to make it corned beef.
And this machine is turning it into corned beef?
It will. The needles penetrate the muscle and put the salt and the sugars into the beef.
Winston's also sells that Irish bacon Maureen made for me, and all kinds of Irish sausages, too. The company was started by Jerry's father, Michael. When he immigrated in the 1960s, he noticed that while there was a huge Irish-American population in Chicago, there wasn't a whole lot of real Irish food.
Well, I think the Irish Americans really go back to the roots in March when they go to the drive-thru McDonald's and they go for the Shamrock Shake.
Okay.
I'll dig in.
But a new wave of Irish immigrants like Michael Winston and Maureen O'Looney helped revive traditional Irish culture in Chicago, from music to dance to food.
You begin to see the Irish sort of turning around and embracing their Irishness.
And now in Chicago, you can find plenty of Irish food at pubs and restaurants like Chief O'Neill's.
So when you think of Irish food, do you think of fish? I didn't. The chef here told us that salmon is very big there.
The food here reflects recent changes that have taken place in Ireland. The country has become wealthier, attracting immigrants from all over Europe and even the world, and they've influenced the cuisine. Restaurants like this one are starting to bring that international flavor back to Chicago.
It's giving the food more dimension, giving it a little more depth.
It's sushi night at Denali's, a kosher pizza place in Skokie, where most of the customers are religious Jews.
So we have the vegetable sushi, and we have salmon, we have tuna.
It's actually relatively easy to make sushi that conforms to Jewish dietary laws. They can use any fish that has fins and easily removable scales.
Shellfish and crustaceans are not kosher. So, for instance, we have what looks like crab, it's mock crab. It's really made of whiting.
But making sure the pizza is kosher is a little more complicated.
When the dough rises, a small portion is taken off and burned up in the oven. It's a remembrance of when the temple stood in Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago, of giving a portion of everything to God.
Because pizza dough is essentially bread, the customers say the traditional prayer over bread before they start eating. And you're not going to find a cheese and sausage pizza here.
Biblically, we're taught that you cannot eat meat with milk.
In fact, they even use special vegetarian or bioengineered cheese instead of cheeses made with animal enzymes.
The way you know it's kosher is it has a hechsher in it. A hechsher is like a stamp by an approved agency.
If it was made here in Chicago, there's a good chance it was approved by the Chicago Rabbinical Council.
Now this has in it the butter fat.
They send rabbis to carefully inspect local factories to make sure everything's made according to Jewish law.
What do you need, my man?
Of course, when we think of Jewish food, we tend to think of this.
Anybody else need soap, ladies and gentlemen? Do we have a potato shake with that, you know?
Most of Chicago's classic Jewish delis, like Manny's, aren't kosher at all.
Move the line, buddy.
What makes these foods Jewish
Prep block to go.
is that they were brought to America by Jews from Eastern Europe. Between 1880 and 1925, about 2 million Eastern European Jews immigrated to America. Many came from rural towns called shtetls.
Now, is this a lot like what we would have seen in a shtetl?
Very much so.
On Friday afternoons, the stores along Devon Avenue in West Rogers Park are packed with observant Jews preparing for the Sabbath.
In the shtetl, everything would be very crowded, and you would have all the stores in one central street.
Like many Jews in this neighborhood, Yohanan Petrovsky emigrated from the former Soviet Union. And he's a historian of Eastern Europe, so he knows how this neighborhood looks and even tastes like the old country.
The bagel. Now that's Jewish food, right?
You think. However, the recipe is a Slavic recipe.
It turns out that many of the foods we think of as Jewish are actually borrowed or adapted from other European ethnic groups.
In Russian, it's called bublik.
Bublik.
But when you look at it, you would say, it's a bagel.
As Jews have migrated, they've spread these foods around the world.
Well, basically, this is called in Russian ragalik. And Jews borrowed the word, making it into Yiddish rogalach. Borscht is typical Russian and Ukrainian. Certainly Jews borrowed the word and the recipe. Gefilte, most likely the word and the concept was borrowed from the German culture. Kasha is a buckwheat, which was used by Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish peasantry before Russian government brought potatoes.
Now, vodka, this is not Jewish, but there's something Jewish about it, right?
You won't believe, for some 600 years, Jews were the only ones who were privileged with distilling and selling the alcohol.
The Slavs knew they could trust the Jews to sell the alcohol without drinking it all. Jews weren't known to be big drinkers.
Ukrainian peasants would say, «Жиди дурні, мають горілку і продають її», meaning, Jews are fools. They have vodka and they sell it.
This is a lamb tagine. It's typically Moroccan.
For Laura Frankel, Jewish food is a lot more than bagels and kasha.
This is a bulgur and kalamat olive flatbread.
She might come from a European Jewish family, but as a professional kosher chef,
And then our dried fruit goes in.
she likes to explore cuisines from around the world.
The dish is lachamajin. It's almost like a pizza.
Tonight's menu is inspired by the Sephardic Jews. It's heavily influenced by the foods of the Middle East and North Africa, where these Jews have lived for centuries.
This kind of food actually is more interesting. It's a lot of flavor. I can kick it up with some spices.
But this kosher chef didn't always keep kosher. She grew up in a non-religious household. But her decision to keep kosher was ultimately less about pleasing her palate and more about rediscovering her roots.
We liked the option of having the children learn about their heritage and this thousands of years of richness that really we didn't know anything about it ourselves until we started exploring and learning about it. Once you take one step, the next one comes, and then the next one comes, and pretty soon before you know it, you're all in.
Many of us heard the same thing when we were kids. Finish your food. There are people starving in China. Well, your parents were right. This was one of those starving people.
She said basically they were so poor they just used the smell of the frying fish from the rich neighbor across the way to go with the rice.
As the flavor.
Yeah, exactly.
Mrs. Ju lives in Chicago's Chinatown, but she grew up in Toisan, a beleaguered county in southern China that was devastated by overpopulation, floods, droughts, and famine. Most of Chicago's early Chinese immigrants came from that one county, including Jean Moy's family.
When we had food to eat, there was a lot of preserved foods like pickles, salted fish, salted pork, salted shrimp paste.
In Toisan, they would scrape together whatever ingredients they could find and use them to flavor their rice. It's a dish they call
ham ha chao fan.
But you probably know it as fried rice.
It's very, very good.
People started leaving Toisan for America in the 1850s. Many found jobs in California working on the Transcontinental Railroad, but they often encountered brutal racism there.
They would be harassed by gangs of roving thugs in the street, like for instance in Los Angeles in the 1870s, where Chinese were dragged from their beds and lynched.
Many found their way to Chicago. This tended to be a less hostile place. Because so many Chicagoans were immigrants, the Chinese didn't stand out so much.
Nobody spoke English. Everybody had a funny accent. Everybody wore strange clothes.
They started settling in Chinatown in the 1870s, but not the one we know today. Chicago's original Chinatown was around Clark and Van Buren. Chinese food really started catching on here after 1900, thanks to a dish that wasn't even Chinese.
So chop suey essentially is the greatest culinary practical joke played upon Americans ever.
Chop suey, which literally means mixed pieces, was probably invented in New York. Americans were excited by the dish because it included exotic ingredients, or at least they seemed exotic at the time.
It always has bean sprouts. Bean sprouts were totally unknown to Americans. Water chestnuts, which had to come from China, and chop suey is always made with celery.
Soon, there were other Americanized dishes like chow mein, which was basically chop suey with fried noodles, and egg foo young, which is more or less an omelet. Keep in mind, these dishes were being concocted by amateur chefs from Toisan, a region of China where food was scarce. These chefs took the cuisine of Toisan and added more meat, more oil, and a few American ingredients for good measure.
For instance, sometimes we'll see like lobster with cheese, and it's like, well, cheese is not an indigenous Chinese food.
Americans called this cuisine Cantonese. That isn't entirely wrong. Toisan is in a province that we used to call Canton, and they speak a dialect of Cantonese there. Chinatown moved from Clark and Van Buren to its current location in 1910, partly because of a dispute between two rival fraternal societies called Tongs. Chinese restaurants were once some of the fanciest eateries in Chicago. They featured the latest big bands and served filet mignon and French peas alongside chop suey. Chinatown's oldest restaurant is Wan Kao, which has been in the same upstairs location since 1927. You can get the old Cantonese standards here, but they also have dim sum. Dim sum consists of dumplings and other steamed dishes that are traditionally served with tea. This was one of many new and exciting types of Chinese food that swept Chicago after World War II. Starting in the 1950s, a slew of new immigrants from Hong Kong and Mandarin-speaking people from Taiwan and mainland China brought a wide array of new foods to Chicago. But all most Americans knew was that their food was spicier, and they called it all Mandarin.
What Mandarin really meant is something different from chop suey.
Many of these new immigrants were professionals and students who settled in the suburbs. They rarely ventured into Chinatown, partly because they couldn't communicate with the Toisanese.
Cantonese is like another foreign language to me. Sometimes we have to communicate with them in English.
But more recently, people from mainland China have been finding their way to Chinatown. The owners of this restaurant, Spring World, are from Yunnan province.
These restaurants right now, just because of the sheer number of Chinese living here, they can sustain their business. So they tend to become more and more authentic. Wow.
Greek restaurants just wouldn't be the same without flaming saganaki. But surprisingly, it's not Greek. It was invented in Chicago. At least according to this man, who claims he was the first to light his cheese on fire. Chris Liakouris owns the Parthenon restaurant in Greektown. When he opened this place in 1968, he fried his saganaki in the kitchen, just like they did in Greece. But then, a customer gave him a better idea.
One of them said, why don't you put a shot of brandy on and flame it? They bring 2 more saganakis, shot of metaxa, we flame it, opa, it goes up on the air. Beautiful, I love it.
It took Chris a while to perfect his flaming saganaki, but eventually it caught on. And now most Chicagoans know at least one word of Greek.
Opa is expressions of happiness. If someone is dancing, everybody they go opa.
From Greektown to the city's candy industry to your local diner, Greeks have had a huge impact on how this city eats. But for Greeks, the real heart and soul of the community is in the Greek Orthodox Church. Of course, you'll find that even here, food plays an important role. Back in the kitchen at St. Andrew's Church in Edgewater, the faithful gather to make huge Greek meals for their annual festivals.
Everybody is in the kitchen cooking and baking for weeks and preparing.
Some of the foods here actually serve a sacred purpose. Instead of communion wafers, Greeks use this altar bread.
This is called prosphoro or endidoro. When women make the bread, there's actually a stamp, and it means Jesus Christ conquers.
This cake may look festive, but it's reserved for solemn occasions. When someone dies, their loved ones eat this following the memorial service.
This is called koliva or sitari. So koliva is a wheat-based dish. Wheat represents the resurrection, so that which is planted into the ground, it's from the scripture, rises anew with resurrection, in hopes that our loved ones that have departed will then be resurrected.
Looking around the kitchen here, you'll find that many of the dishes can be traced back to the same region of Greece, the Peloponnese. That's because most of Chicago's Greeks have roots there.
This is called doxa, which is the name of the village where it's from, Gortynus chicken. And having chicken was a very special thing for them. The area of the Peloponnese was very mountainous. They had a few goats and chickens, and they grew what they could as far as agriculture and really made the most of everything there.
It was hard times in the Peloponnese that drove Greeks to Chicago shortly after the Great Fire of 1871. They were led here by a pioneer named Chris Chakonis. He knew that Chicago needed laborers to help rebuild, so he returned to his hometown near Sparta and spread the word. He came to be known as the Columbus of Sparta.
To this day, when I see the Chicago Water Tower, I just have a new sense of feeling that my ancestors actually helped to rebuild the city as well.
Greek laborers soon began settling south of the current Greek town in an area known as the Delta. Most of the neighborhood was demolished in the 1950s and 60s to make room for the Eisenhower Expressway and the University of Illinois. But at one time, the Delta was the largest Greek settlement in America. As many as 40,000 Greeks lived there. Many got into the food business, selling fruits and vegetables. Some eventually grew their businesses into grocery stores and restaurants. But while Chicago's Italians started Italian restaurants, and Chinese opened Chinese restaurants, Greeks took a different approach.
They early on realized that there were not enough Greeks in the city to open Greek restaurants solely serving Greeks. So they're ambitious and they branch out and they move out into other neighborhoods in the city and they start to open lunchrooms. And these are working men's restaurants.
Many of these lunchrooms evolved into more family-friendly restaurants after World War II, when a growing number of families had the disposable income to eat out.
Greek entrepreneurs start putting in booths. They move the kitchen into the back so that you can't see the cook anymore. They get a waitress out in front so that you've got a woman's face to put a kind of more feminine edge. They have tremendous menus that offer everything under the sun, and they become very popular.
Lou Mitchell's is one classic example. This Greek-owned institution is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's been at the same location on Jackson Boulevard since 1923. At least one Greek item found its way onto the menu at these Greek-American restaurants. Chicago grew into America's gyros manufacturing capital. This company, Grecian Delights, makes 40% of the nation's gyros. Its founder was actually an engineer who invented the auto-donor, that now familiar device that they use to cook the gyros. Other Greeks started candy shops. Margie's on the north side is one of the only ones left. It's still owned by the Polos family, who opened it in 1921. Dove candy stores on the south side are all gone, but the ice cream creations of its founder, Leo Stefanos, can now be found all over the country.
Yes, sir. What you like?
I'd like a, what's best?
The best. Double cheese, the best.
Okay, I'll have double cheeseburger and fries.
No fries, chips.
Okay, and a Pepsi.
No Pepsi, Coke.
Down on Lower Michigan Avenue, you'll find Chicago's most famous Greek-owned restaurant, the Billy Goat Tavern.
Cheeseburger, 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 cheeseburger.
This place was catapulted to national fame in 1978 by a Saturday Night Live skit.
Cheeseburger, 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 cheeseburger.
John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, they got the pronunciation, the way you say it.
Yes.
Cheeseburger. Did they come here and listen to you say it?
Yeah. No fries, cheap. All these guys, they used to work in Second City. They used to come here right over here.
Sam's uncle, Bill Sionis, opened the original tavern across from Chicago Stadium in 1934. He called it the Lincoln Tavern, but when a goat fell off a passing truck and wandered inside, Bill earned the nickname Billy Goat, and he changed the tavern's name. But he put a name on the wall that's a little harder to pronounce. If you say it correctly, you get a free beer.
I can't even begin to pronounce that. How do you say it? Give me the name.
Papa Theo Dimitro Kumudojokakakopoulos.
Bill Sionis and his goat played a legendary role in Chicago Cubs history. In 1945, Bill tried to bring his pet into Wrigley Field for Game 4 of the World Series, but the goat was denied entrance. Bill was outraged. He declared that the Cubs would never win a World Series again so long as his goat was shut out. Sam's tried many times to undo the hex. The Cubs have wisely let him bring his own goat onto the field.
Where do you get the goat from?
La Porte, Indiana.
This is really your goat?
Yes.
But despite Sam's efforts, the curse seems to live on.
Here is a braised lamb.
While food was so often a ticket to the American dream for Greek immigrants,
Delicious.
Greek food didn't really catch on here until the 1960s. But it wasn't just gyros, moussaka, and baklava that drew Chicagoans to Greektown. It was also the fun.
Flaming cheese, singing waiters. They go in very big for entertainment.
They gave their restaurants a spirit that can best be described with the one word of Greek that every Chicagoan knows.
Opa!
Coming up, Chicago's candy industry and German, Puerto Rican, Indian, and Italian food. Chicago was once America's undisputed candy capital. Snickers, Butterfingers, and Lemonheads, Pixies and Milk Duds, Juicy Fruits, Frango Mints, Tootsie Rolls, Brock's Peppermints, and so many others all came from Chicago.
Oh yeah, back in the early 60s, late 50s, almost every other block had some type of candy store, even the mom and pop type.
Jerry Myers has worked in Chicago's candy industry for 40 years. One of his biggest claims to fame, Jerry invented Fannie Mae's famous eggnog cream candy.
I actually went out and I bought about 5 quarts of different brands of eggnog. tasted them until I can match what I thought would be a good eggnog flavor.
And then you went to your cardiologist after that, right?
Jerry has a chocoholic's dream job.
What we're basically going to do is taste this milk chocolate here.
Okay.
It involves tasting a lot of chocolate, and he's quite good at it.
Just on your tongue. Just the tip of the tongue.
Where I might taste the obvious,
it's chocolate.
He tastes all kinds of flavors.
Chocolate, sweet, dairy, and then bitter at the end.
Now, are you like a dancer, or is your tongue insured by the Lloyds of London or something?
No, it's not.
Part of what made Chicago such a candy manufacturing hub was its sizable European immigrant population, who brought candy-making skills over with them. And the Midwest had all the right ingredients, too.
We use a lot of corn syrup and sugar, and corn, as you know, is grown in this part of the country, and we use dairies from the Midwest.
At the Tootsie Roll factory on Chicago's southwest side, these Midwestern ingredients are cooked, mixed together, cooled, and formed into these gigantic Tootsie Rolls.
And it's going through an extruder so that it's in manageable sizes.
So this is not going to be one big Tootsie Roll here?
No, this piece of Tootsie Roll is going to be into some hundreds of pieces of small Tootsie Rolls.
Okay.
The recipe for the Tootsie Roll was brought over from Austria by Leo Hirschfeld. He named his candy after his daughter, whose nickname was Tootsie.
How many Tootsie Rolls do you crank out of here every day?
Oh, we make about 66 million Tootsie Rolls every single day.
A day?
A day.
They also make Tootsie Pops here. And Dots, those gumdrops on steroids that you get at the movie theater. After more than a century of being America's candy capital, in the last decade, many of Chicago's big candy companies have gone under or moved their manufacturing abroad. Some say the future of Chicago's candy industry lies in so-called artisanal chocolate makers, like Chocolate Potpourri in Glenview. These smaller companies add a personal touch to their candies.
These are not machines making the products here, right?
Machines don't do this. Mm-hmm. I think it's really the attention to the detail and the love that goes into making the product.
Is this going to make Chicago back into a candy capital again?
I hope it would. Yeah, it would be great for Chicago.
But Chicago has satisfied America's sweet tooth with more than just candy. Chicago confectioner F.W. Ruckheim created a caramel-covered popcorn which he debuted at the 1893 World's Fair. Ruckheim gave a sample to one of his salesmen who exclaimed, "That's Cracker Jack!" The Cracker Jack brand was relatively obscure until 1908, when it got what might have been the best bit of free advertising in American history.
Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack.
4 years later, the company started putting a prize in every box. The first Dairy Queen store opened in Joliet in 1940, where it introduced the world to soft-serve ice cream. The Twinkie was invented at this Hostess factory in Schiller Park. James Dewar, the factory's manager, noticed that their shortcake pans sat idle except during the 6 weeks when strawberries were in season. So he came up with the idea of injecting a filling into the cakes and selling them year-round. They were originally filled with banana cream, but the flavor was switched to vanilla during World War II when bananas were rationed for the war effort. The caramel apple was invented in Chicago, at least according to the Affy-Table Company, which started mass marketing them in the 1940s. The company's name, Affy-Table, not only conveyed fun, but it conveniently put them first in their section of the phone book. And the brownie is said to have been invented at Chicago's Palmer House Hotel. According to the story, socialite Bertha Palmer directed the hotel's chef to create a new dessert for visitors to the 1893 World's Fair. The hotel is still making the same recipe there today.
Hi, 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 hey, welcome to the Browers in Chicago. Yeah, yeah.
1 in every 4 Chicagoans was German back in 1900.
Welcome to the Browers in Chicago. Yeah, yeah, yes.
Chicago isn't quite so German anymore, but there's still plenty of Gemütlichkeit at local German restaurants, where you can get a taste of the days when German food was a Chicago mainstay.
What is the Brauhaus famous for?
liver dumpling soup.
Harry Kempf owns the Chicago Brow House in Lincoln Square.
That is very good for you.
He agreed to give me a brief tutorial on German food.
All right, here we got the famous Wiener Schnitzel. A la Holstein. Holstein means there's a fried egg on top.
Is there any particular way to eat it? I mean, do you break
with
the
a fork,
egg? Or?
With a fork and knife, mostly.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly with fork and knife. With it comes big bowl of goulash soup.
Goulash, now that's Hungarian, right? Not German.
Goulash, everything is German.
Everything's German, okay.
The other guys copy everything from us. You know, this is how it is. Really, I'll tell you the truth. This, of course, is a herring, a raw herring, which is our sushi, with a cream sauce and pickles and a boiled potato. With this along comes our famous roasted duckling. Now, get a load of that. Red cabbage. Or sauerkraut.
Yeah.
Sauerkraut was invented in China.
Well, how did it become a German thing?
Well, because the Germans, they made it a little better than the Chinese. Then, of course,
sausage.
German bratwurst.
This is not the heart-healthy diet, is it?
That is very good for you.
Is it?
You need good fat to live. Steak tartare is sirloin meat ground, and then we have a little egg here. Now I want to see how tough you are. Yeah, bite in it. You'll live 100 years. Go ahead.
That's good. Thanks.
That's healthy.
That is healthy.
This is very healthy.
Good.
Yes, enjoy it and feel good.
These foods would have been found on dinner tables all over 19th century Chicago. Many Germans settled in North Side neighborhoods like Old Town before migrating up Lincoln Avenue to Lincoln Park, Lakeview, and Lincoln Square. You can still find German food in these old enclaves. Dinkel's is one of the few remaining German bakeries in Chicago. When it opened in 1922, there were so many German bakers in town that they had their own singing club. Paulina Market is among the last of the old-fashioned butcher shops.
How many people are you serving?
Two. They've been making their own sausages here since 1949. But Chicago's most famous German restaurant is downtown. When the Berghoff announced in 2005 that it was closing, the city mourned the death of its oldest restaurant. But a year later, it was quietly reopened by a fourth-generation Berghoff. She's trying to update some of the family's traditional German dishes.
Less gravies, lighter sauces, and then if you really want to, you can have a Wiener Schnitzel.
Carlin's great-grandfather was a German immigrant named Hermann Berghoff, who started a small brewery in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He came to Chicago to sell his beer at the 1893 World's Fair, but the authorities wouldn't let him. So he defiantly set up a stand just outside the fair. Then he tried to get a license to distribute his beer in Chicago, and again he was denied. So he opened the Berghoff Cafe, where he could sell it himself. The Berghoff served working-class German immigrants all the foods they missed from home.
I think people came here and had specific food items that they had in their mind and heart that reminded them of some part of their family history. I think they smelled that stuff cooking and they felt at home.
But World War I changed everything for Chicago's Germans.
There was a tremendous anti-German backlash. The Frankfurter became the hot dog. The hamburger became the Salisbury steak. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage.
The war hurt Hermann Berghoff's business.
He had 5 sons. All 5 sons were in the American military. And he said, you know, he hung a sign in the front window. When he had those stars in the old days when your kids were in service. And he says, my sons are doing the same thing your sons are doing. I came here the same reason you came here.
During and after the 2 world wars, Chicago's Germans were eager to show that they were Americans. Many moved to the suburbs and assimilated. Some even denied their German heritage. But after World War II, a new wave of German immigrants breathed new life into German Chicago. Harry Kempf came in 1956. Before opening his restaurant, he started a German band that played German music all over the city.
You know, my daddy says, well, you want to be a musician or a chef? You can only do one, you know. And then I said, I'd rather play my instrument. There's more girls out there.
Ultimately, he found a way to have it all, opening a restaurant where Chicagoans could celebrate German music and German food.
wait, you got a drink.
Thank you very much.
This little storefront restaurant in Humboldt Park is the birthplace of a Puerto Rican sandwich sensation. The jibarito, a sandwich made on plantains instead of bread, can be found all over America.
Even in New York.
Thanks to this man, Peter Figueroa.
Even in Orlando and Miami.
The word jibarito is slang for hillbilly, which is exactly how Peter describes himself.
Oh.
He's from the center of Puerto Rico, where bread wasn't always so easy to come by, but there were plantains aplenty.
Oh, plenty of plantain, bro. We grow plantains and bananas like crazy.
Peter didn't exactly invent this sandwich. He dug the recipe out of a Puerto Rican newspaper.
Once a plantain floats, they're really happy, you know, so now we're going to get it and smash it.
Peter perfected the recipe, named it the jibarito, and started a sandwich craze.
I guess I did, and I'm loving it, bro.
He now serves his famous sandwich at 3 restaurants in Chicago.
Any other questions?
But whatever you do, don't ask Peter to eat a jibarito himself.
You want me to eat one? I don't eat jibaritos, bro. I ate it so many. For 12 years eating jibaritos, so, all right?
Feeding Chicago's South Asians can be a complicated business. Some are Hindus.
My mom did not allow me to eat meat.
Including some from upper castes.
I had never eaten cheese.
Others are Pakistani Muslims who don't mind piling on the meat.
This is food from the southern region of India.
But whatever their religion,
Northern Indian, Punjabi food,
and wherever they come from,
we have foods from Gujarat.
They can find the foods they love on a single street in West Rogers Park.
Everything that you miss back home, you can find it on Devon Avenue.
South Asians started coming to Chicago in large numbers in the 1960s. They were mostly students and professionals. Once they started bringing over their extended families, they discovered an affordable, family-friendly neighborhood along Devon Avenue on Chicago's far north side.
One guy had a grocery store, one guy had a clothing store.
Swedel Patel's family opened an Indian grocery store here back in 1974, and a slew of South Asian businesses soon followed.
That's where this cultural mecca of Devon Avenue formed.
Today, South Asians travel to Devon from literally all over America to find foods that are hard to come by on this side of the globe. Now, what is this? Some of these foods, I have to admit, I've never seen before.
This is God's gift to people that have diabetes. It's called an Indian bitter melon.
Bitter melon. And it's bitter?
It is bitter. It is bitter. We have right here this thing called a snake gourd. The gourd inside is somewhat snake gourdy, if you will.
What's
Indian eggplant?
Oh, okay. You slice it down.
Just slice it down. Yeah, you just get rid of this gourd here, cut it into small pieces, and fry it up.
Dosakai.
Dosakai. I'm sorry, I have no idea. What it is.
Why so many different kinds of beans and lentils?
Primarily, you have to remember, those that are vegetarians, this is their main source of protein. And then on the flip side, on this side,
yeah, look at all
you go and get your different kinds of rice, from brown basmati to just a regular basmati.
Look at this selection of spices. Milder, hotter. Do you eat it this hot?
I have to eat it that hot.
You do?
I have to.
Wait a second. $35 a box?
$35. They come in by air.
And why do people want these Indian mangoes?
The taste is just there. When you open an Indian mango, the fragrance, the aroma is just mind-blowing.
It's not like any mango I've ever had. It's so smooth. Okay, what is this?
This is a crunchy masala dosa.
While Chicago's South Asian community may have diverse tastes, the selection of restaurants here hasn't always been so eclectic. Historically, almost all of them served a kind of North Indian cuisine called Mughalai. The Mughals were a Muslim empire that ruled over India starting in the 16th century. Their most famous contribution to India was the Taj Mahal.
They paid attention to detail. They had architecture. They liked structure. And that's what you see here. Something that's layered. You've got the rice. You've got a nice blend of color.
This is the food of the Mughal royalty. It features rich sauces of complex spices with plenty of meat, cooked in a tandoori oven. When Indian Americans go out for Indian food, this is often what they treat themselves to.
Because this is the food that would take them hours to make at home.
The tandoori ovens.
The tandoori ovens, the spicing, the flavorings.
But more recently, the Mughal reign over Chicago has felt some competition.
You'll have a plantain curry here, a mixed vegetable curry here.
The number of South Indian restaurants has grown here in the last few years. Vegetarians feel right at home in South Indian restaurants, and more adventurous eaters seek it out for its spiciness.
When you cut this open, potato filling there.
Devon Avenue also has its share of Pakistani restaurants. The natives of this majority Muslim nation often favor meat dishes. This restaurant, Sabri Nahari, is named for a beef stew that's popular in Pakistan. The meat, of course, is halal. Devon Avenue continues to be a vibrant hub of South Asian foods and businesses. But many South Asians have settled in suburbs like Naperville, Schaumburg, and Skokie.
And then we have frozen Indian curry.
And Swetal Patel is catering to their changing eating habits. Would you find frozen food like this much in India?
Not much at all.
His company manufactures these frozen meals in India, imports them to Skokie, and sells them at the 34 grocery stores his family now owns across America. Why is it popular in this country?
Convenience. It takes 45 minutes, 50 minutes to prepare an Indian entree. This, you microwave it, 5 minutes, you're done.
And what could be more American than a frozen dinner? We might call it Italian beef, but it's definitely not from Italy.
If you go to Italy with an Italian beef, they laugh.
In fact, it was invented right here in Chicago. The only thing Italian about this sandwich...
A pure beef sandwich.
...were the people who made it.
You actually can hold this up to the light, and you can see right through it almost.
Italian beef is in Chris Pacelli's blood.
Every morning I have one.
Well, okay, figuratively, too.
Fresh garlic.
Chris's grandfather sold Italian beef.
Then we stir up the seasoning a little bit.
And Chris runs Al's Beef on Taylor Street, which his dad and Uncle Al opened in 1938. I like mine dipped with sweet peppers. If you grew up in Chicago, you probably like your Italian beef a certain way.
I'm going to have an Italian beef also. Slightly dipped.
The most important factor is how much juice you like on your sandwich.
Oh, the way to eat it, bud, is with some juice.
Yeah.
You don't ever want to eat Italian beef sandwich dry. You know, a lot of people come and say, oh, I want it dry, I don't want to get it all over me.
Yeah.
They got to learn how to eat it.
It's a special way to eat it?
Oh, yeah, it's the Italian stance.
The Italian stance?
Right. You got to, because it's so juicy.
All right.
You got to lean back, put your forearms on the counter, and you dig into it. So you don't get to see all the juice, what I'm talking about. So you don't get it all over you. I'm wearing white.
Chris's grandfather was one of Italian beef's early pioneers.
Oh, I had the raw product.
Like many of the original beef salesmen, his grandfather got his start as a peddler.
Like you would see at a ball game, a guy with a thing around his neck and he had sandwiches.
Oh, okay. As the story goes, poor Italian immigrants would hire peddlers like Chris's grandfather to cater their weddings.
And you would eat it at the buffet style.
The wedding party couldn't afford much meat, so these peddlers had to make a little beef go a long way, inspiring a brilliant idea.
What if I slice this real thin, change the taste, put some Italian spices in it, you know, your oregano, your garlics and all that, and make it a tender sandwich, right?
And the rest, as they say, is history. It's a little odd that Chicago's famous beef sandwich was invented by Italians, because your typical Italian immigrant wasn't eating much meat at all.
This is what my mother did.
At her home in Norridge, Marge Porcelli and her daughter Chris are making a favorite meal of Marge's immigrant parents.
Good, done.
Pasta, no sauce, barely even any cheese, and certainly no meat.
It's pasta with zucchini and tomato. That's it. That's how we grew up. We had one vegetable with the pasta, whether it's zucchini, broccoli, cauliflower, just one vegetable. pasta with peas, one vegetable. If you put them all together and mingle them all in one dish, what are you going to make the next night?
In Italy, Marge's parents ate this out of necessity.
You couldn't afford a lot of meat, no.
They were quite poor, and so were most Italian immigrants who came to Chicago.
They eked out livings on small farms where what they ate was what they could dig from the ground.
Here in Chicago, Italians tended to stick with the vegetable-heavy diet they knew from home, which seemed weird to the city's Northern European majority. To them, Italians ate unusual concoctions that had to be terrible for their health, like vegetables with olive oil and garlic.
They look at Italian diets and they say, there's not enough meat. How can you possibly do the back-breaking labor we want you to do if you don't eat more meat?
Because the rest of the city ate so differently, Chicago's Italians had trouble finding their favorite ingredients. So Italians started selling their own food. Many Italian food purveyors began as peddlers, selling fruits and vegetables on the street. And of course, Chicago's neighborhoods had plenty of Italian restaurants. Tofano's Vernon Park Tap has been in the same spot near Taylor Street since 1930. Back then, owners Teresa and Joseph DeBono did the cooking next door at their house, then handed the food through this old window to the waiters. Chicago's Italian restaurants served mostly an Italian clientele at first, but all of those old prejudices against Italian food really dissolved during Prohibition. While the Volstead Act made most alcohol illegal, it did make an exception for wine that was homemade for personal use. And Italian restaurant owners graciously shared their homemade wine with customers.
Really adventurous Chicagoans could go have homemade red wine in a coffee cup along with a plate of spaghetti and meatballs.
Restaurant owner Al Capitanini knew how to give his customers the sense of adventure and romanticism they were looking for.
My dad says, why not? Checkered red tablecloths and a glass of wine and spaghetti meatball.
He opened the Italian Village restaurant downtown in 1927. The Capitaninis learned how to cater to their American customers' appetites with heavier Italian fare.
Heavy on the sauce. Here in America, they wish albonanza, a lot of sauce.
One hearty Italian dish was actually born in Chicago, or at least named here.
Chicken Vesuvio originated in Chicago.
There's much debate about who served the original Chicken Vesuvio. Italian Village is one of several Chicago restaurants that lay claim to it. But of all the foods that Italian immigrants carried with them across the Atlantic, nothing made the leap to the American mainstream quite like pizza. Oh, of course in Italy, it didn't look anything like this. In fact, when Marge first tried pizza at a restaurant, she was stunned.
I thought, this is pizza?
In places like Rome and Naples, pizza has a thin crust, and it's lightly covered with tomatoes, cheese, and other toppings. You can find this in Chicago at places like Spaccanapoli on the north side.
There's no cheese or whatever they put today, sausage and mushrooms and all that. No,
That's not
no,
authentic
no,
as far as you're concerned. Americans have smothered it in tomato sauce, loaded it with cheese, and added everything from pineapple to barbecued chicken. We've even stuffed it.
Americans like to overdo just about everything.
Of course, here in Chicago, our most famous contribution to the world of pizza is deep dish. The deep dish phenomenon was born here at Uno's in 1943, when owner Ike Sewell set out to give Chicago something new. His idea? Well, his original idea was to open a Mexican restaurant.
Ike Sewell was from Texas, and he remembered Mexican food from his childhood and wanted to open a place like this in Chicago.
So Sewell's business partner, Rick Ricardo, enlisted the help of a Mexican bartender to give them a taste of authentic Mexican food.
And it was the worst Mexican meal in the history of Mexican meals, and Ricardo got sick.
Sewell and Ricardo went back to the drawing board, and soon they came up with another idea, pizza. But it couldn't be just any old pizza.
Sewell, who was your macho guy, wanted something that was a meal.
Their idea was essentially to build the pizza upside down. Cheese, then toppings, then sauce, all built on top of a thick, heavy crust. Though there are different versions of the story about how they came up with the idea.
I heard one story that the reason it was deep dish was because they had these pans that they had to fill.
In fact, not everyone agrees on who invented deep dish pizza. Some say that Uno's bartender, Rudy Malnati, had a hand in it. His son, Lou, later opened up his own pizza place. But one thing's for sure, deep dish pizza was the perfect match for Chicago. It was a big pizza that seemed to fit our city's brawny image.
If you grew up on deep dish, chances are you're not letting go of it. It's just part of a city identity, and I wouldn't mess with anyone who's going to take a stand because it's knife and fork food.
Coming up, Mexican and Polish food and the Chicago hot dog. When word gets out that Teresa Fraga is making her famous enchiladas, people start lining up.
Like you have to keep watching them, turning them so they don't get burned.
It's her son's 41st birthday party at Teresa's home in Pilsen. And she's wrapping one gift for him that money just can't buy.
What's different about these enchiladas is that we use the authentic cheese that you're supposed to use, queso añejo enchilado.
Enchilada literally means chili. Teresa made this garlicky guajillo chili sauce the night before.
Everybody likes them when they're toasted.
She cooks the enchiladas on this Mexican griddle called a comal.
If I get the right kind of tortilla, if I get the right kind of chile, and I get the right kind of fire, I'm happy.
Teresa didn't always have these luxuries. She was born in Zacatecas, Mexico, and she grew up in Texas, where she and her family were farm workers.
When we immigrated to the United States, I was 7 years old, and we worked in the fields. We were undocumented.
Out in the fields, they didn't have a big comal or the time to make enchiladas. Instead, they had to stick with foods that were fast and portable.
Beans and egg tacos, potato and egg tacos. It was practical. You know, you don't have a lunch hour. When you're poor and working in the fields, you can run with your taco.
Like Teresa, many of Chicago's early Mexican immigrants started out as migrant laborers. They fled the Mexican Revolution in 1910 and worked their way across the Great Plains, harvesting sugar beets and working on the railroads before landing in Chicago. Here, they found not only better paying, steadier jobs, but a place where they could put down their roots. After years of migrating, here in Chicago, Teresa became a citizen and worked her way through college and eventually graduate school. Today, she's a school administrator, and now she has the time and the money to make the foods she loves.
What else could I give my 41-year-old son for his birthday? But enchiladas is what makes him happy.
God, now I know why you're so famous. That's amazing. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry I got ahead of you. There's a whole line back there.
As early as the 1920s, there were 3 Mexican communities in Chicago, on the southeast side, in back of the yards, and on the near west side near Hull House. At least one non-Mexican recognized the demand for Mexican food way back then. A German immigrant named Henry Steinbarth sold Mexican chorizo sausage on the southwest side. His company grew into the Mexican food giant La Preferida. Soon, chile con carne, or as we know it, chili, popped up at chili joints all over Chicago, like Lindy's. Chicagoans thought it was a quintessential Mexican dish.
Chile con carne was never a Mexican dish.
It probably originated in Texas. Tamales became popular here too. Well, sort of. A Chicago-style tamale, or corn roll tamale, is wrapped in parchment paper instead of a corn husk, so it's easy to boil. The most popular brand is Tom Tom Tamales, a Southwest Side company that was founded by 3 Greeks who were all named, you guessed it, Tom.
Of course, a Mexican tamale is much different than that.
At Southside institutions like the Ramova Grill, They serve something called a mother-in-law, which is a Chicago-style tamale covered in chili. Put that on a bun and you have a mother-in-law sandwich.
Well, it's another fad that is not real Mexican.
Actual Mexican restaurants weren't so popular with non-Mexicans until the 1950s and 60s, when a slew of new eateries came on the scene like La Margarita, Nuevo León, Los Comales, and Pepe's. And all of these places had one thing in common. They started with a little help from Arturo Velázquez. Velázquez's business was actually selling jukeboxes stocked with Mexican music. But he knew that the more Mexican restaurants there were, the more Mexican jukeboxes he could sell.
It was a two-way street. I got the jukeboxes, you got the location.
Arturo's son, Art, played a more direct role in bringing Mexican food to the masses.
Now, can I taste one?
Sure.
He helped introduce American consumers to an ancient Mexican staple.
The corn tortilla is over 6,000 years old.
But the shelf life of any given tortilla was more like 3 days, too short for supermarkets to stock them.
Tortillas could only be sold frozen or in cans, believe it or not.
So Art hired a chemist who figured out how to preserve them for more than a month. More importantly, Art made tortillas out of flour. Corn tortillas were the Mexican mainstay, though flour was used in northern Mexico. But Art had a feeling that flour would be more popular with the non-Mexican or Anglo market.
Anglos mostly grew up as kids having hot dogs, having hamburgers, having pizza. So all of that is a flour-based bun.
Today, Azteca tortillas are in grocery stores all over America. But the flour tortilla is not the only item that's helped Americans embrace Mexican food. Today, salsa has surpassed ketchup as the biggest-selling condiment in America. And like so many other cuisines that have been Americanized, we've taken simple Mexican foods like taco and piled on our favorite ingredients.
All right, so this is more of an American taco. We got tomatoes and lettuce and cheese, and it's big. Now, why?
Well, I think that we're very familiar with the ingredients.
Like the tomatoes,
like
and
the
lettuce,
tomatoes and the lettuce and the cheese. So, we saw it in a hamburger, and what you're having, if you realize, it's a hamburger that is converted into a taco, right?
Mm-hmm. Dudley Nieto is one of Chicago's most critically acclaimed chefs. But when he's not building little edible sculptures at his swanky eateries, you'll often find him in Mexican enclaves like Pilsen, doing what he calls research. He let me tag along on one of his fact-finding missions. We started at Los Comales, where Dudley showed me what a real Mexican taco should look like.
A small portion, a small tortilla, flavorful onions, cilantro.
It's bare bones for a reason. Like gorditas and tortas and so many other popular Mexican foods, tacos are typically street food. It's kind of like their fast food.
And it's got to be simple, nothing fancy. This is something that, yes, you're going to get a little sloppy with that. You grab it like this from the back, and then you turn your face like a 45 degrees angle.
Oh, there's a correct angle. In Chicago, there's not much street food that you can actually buy out on the street.
Have I got this right here?
Exactly. Oh, you got it right.
But we do have Maxwell Street, and you'll find Mexican peddlers in neighborhoods like Pilsen. Many are stocked with elotes, ears of corn usually covered in butter, mayonnaise, Parmesan cheese, and red pepper.
There's a lot of butter and mayonnaise on this.
Next, Dudley and I went to a Pilsen institution, Carnitas Don Pedro.
So how often do you go to a restaurant where there are only 3 things on the menu?
All 3 have one thing in common: pork. In addition to chorizo, they have chicharrones, crispy pork skins.
Okay, this is definitely not on my low-fat diet.
But what Don Pedro is really famous for
carnitas.
Is his carnitas.
So now we're talking.
Carnitas is pork fried in pork fat. Don Pedro uses only female pigs, which he swears taste the best. Dudley packs some in a tortilla with his favorite fixins.
Is the preparation here particularly special?
It is. It's crispy from outside, it's very tender from inside, and all those flavors combined make the difference.
From Don Pedro, we moved on to La Providencia, a grocery store with a kitchen in the back.
Right in front of us, we have birria.
Birria. Birria is a goat stew. It's popular in the Mexican states of Jalisco and Michoacan. Carnitas, by the way, is also a specialty of Michoacan.
And on this side, we have something very special, which is the menudo.
Menudo is a beef tripe soup. Providencia adds hominy to their menudo, which is especially popular in the Mexican state of Guerrero. These regional specialties are very familiar to the customers here. Nearly 80% of Mexican immigrants to the Chicago area come from Mexico's central and southern states, like Guerrero, Jalisco, and Michoacan. More recently, regional Mexican cuisine has been introduced to non-Mexicans by Chicago chefs like Rick Bayless and Dudley Nieto. Lately, he's been focusing on dishes from the Yucatan Peninsula. Of course, Mexicans have made culinary contributions to Chicago that go far beyond Mexican food. Robert Pina is a Mexican-American sushi chef at a Japanese restaurant owned by Koreans. It's called Midori on Chicago's north side. When Robert came here from Mexico, he didn't even know what sushi was.
I'd say, what's a sushi? You know, and honestly, in the beginning, I didn't really like it.
Robert eventually developed a taste for sushi.
Now I love it, yes.
And he mastered the difficult art of making it. He even created his own sushi roll, the Robert Special.
He has a snow crab meat with a shrimp tempura and a dynamite sauce.
The key ingredient in the dynamite sauce is Mexican chile de árbol, a Korean-owned Japanese restaurant with a Mexican sushi chef. It's a confluence of cultures that's pure Chicago.
You know, the Polish aristocracy would not be eating Polish pierogies.
Dobra Bielinski is both a Polish pastry chef and a European historian.
That is basically a peasant food, cabbage.
As a pastry chef, she likes to think that pierogies and stuffed cabbage are foods fit for a king.
If it was a poor peasant, you know, you'd have 10% meat.
But as a historian, she knows that's not the case.
Most people immigrated from Poland based on economic reasons. They were peasants, and that's the food they ate, and that's the food they brought to America.
It was poverty that drove Poles to Chicago. In fact, the first major wave of Polish immigration was known as za chlebem, meaning for bread. But Chicago turned out to be the land of plenty. Poles built a thriving community here, known as Polonia. It had its own downtown. The North Side neighborhood around Milwaukee and Division Streets was commonly called the Polish downtown. Polonia even had its own dialect.
We used to say we talked po chicagosku. We talked in the Chicago manner. So you would say something like, you'd say, I want to meet you on the corner at Goldblatt's. And you'd say, na kunerja, which you'd never say in Poland, koło Goldblattu, tam gdzie jest streetkar.
And Chicago's Poles created their own culinary traditions, too, celebrating foods that weren't all that popular in Poland, like czarnina, or duck's blood soup. These specialties were often old-fashioned Polish foods that Polish Americans maintained here in Chicago.
For example, the kawachki are a very strange thing. In Poland, nobody makes that, but they did that about 100 years ago.
And then there's the smorgasbord. It's a Swedish invention, but for some reason it became a fixture at Chicago's Polish restaurants.
Nobody does buffets in Poland. That's a shocking thing to see for Poles that come over here.
Today, these traditions survive at Polish restaurants, delis, and bakeries across the city. Chicago's northwest side, and northwest suburbs in particular, maintain a strong Polish flavor, thanks in part to more recent waves of immigrants.
Na zdrowie?
Like Dobra Bielinski, many fled Poland during the communist era. They tended to be highly educated urban professionals in Poland.
Their palate is a little bit different. They're bringing a little bit more fine dining experience.
Dominique Wilk is another of these newer immigrants, and this is one of her favorite dishes, wild pheasant in a rosemary and sage cream sauce.
This is not pierogies. You know, this is not what most people think of when they think of Polish food.
This is the type of dish that the Polish nobleman ate. Where'd you get this pheasant from?
Actually, it was hunted by me.
Hunted by you?
Yes.
There was a long tradition of hunting among the Polish nobility. For centuries, they controlled the land and the right to hunt on it. Of course, in the old days, the men in Dominique's family did all the hunting, while the women cooked. Are you the first woman to cross over to do the hunting?
I believe so. I think times changed a little bit.
If this dish looks more like something you'd see at a fancy French restaurant, that's no accident.
You know, a lot of the aristocrats would travel and spend numerous months in France, and they'd see all of what the French chefs were doing, and they expected the same type of food to be served at their dinner table.
But one group of Poles tended to be a little more independent. The Polish Highlanders come from the Tatry Mountains along Poland's border with Slovakia. They have their own music and dance, and a dialect that most other Poles have trouble understanding. And of course, they have their own cuisine, which you can sample at the Polish Highlanders Hall.
Good evening, Chicagoland viewers, and welcome to the Polish Highlanders.
The dishes here tend to be on the hearty side. The kind of food you might expect from mountain-dwelling people.
We play hard and we eat hard. This is a cutlet, which is like a chopped steak with plenty of mushrooms for embellishment. This is a kwaśnica, which is a sauerkraut soup. It consists of boiled potatoes and spare ribs. This is the famous brigand's plate, and it's a goulash-type plate that has meat on the inside.
The Polish Highlanders Hall is located in the old heart of the Highlanders community on the southwest side. The Highlanders first settled here to be near the stockyards where many of them worked. Frank Boback was one of them. He went on to start a legendary sausage business.
He worked in the stockyards as a butcher, and at night as a hobby, he was making sausage.
He actually started mixing the sausage in Stan's baby pool. Today, Stan is more figuratively swimming in sausage. His company makes 88 miles of sausage every week for distribution all over the country. The Polish sausage has become one of Chicago's most famous exports. But to talk about the Polish sausage might be a bit misleading.
These are veal frankfurters over here. These are parówki delikatasowe, which are deli wieners. Smoked Polish sausage. Our original smoked Polish sausage, kielbasa zwyczajna. Little smokies, more mild in flavor, less garlic, less smoke, more snacky variety.
The most well-known Polish sausage is the standard kielbasa, which is a fancy Polish word that means, well, sausage.
It's pork and very garlicky, lots of garlic.
Few men did as much to put Chicago's Polish sausages on the map as Jim Stefanovich. But he wasn't Polish at all. Jim was a Macedonian immigrant who owned a hot dog stand on Maxwell Street, and he decided to put his own spin on the kielbasa. He made it a bit spicier, and then put it on a bun like a hot dog, creating the famous Maxwell Street Polish.
All it is the Polish in a bun with griddled onions. They are absolutely phenomenal.
These days, you'll see signs for Maxwell Street Polishes all over the city. But the original is still here at Jim's. The store's other claim to fame, the pork chop sandwich. But as much as Chicago loves its Polish sausages, no encased meat has made a bigger impact on our city than this German sausage. Back in Europe, they called it the Frankfurter or the Wiener. But here in America, people joked that you might find anything in one of these sausages, including the family pet. So we called it a hot dog.
Thank you. It was in a meat market on Chicago's north side, probably one that didn't look too different from this one, that a German immigrant named Oscar Mayer started selling sausages. That was in 1883. Within a few decades, his name was world famous.
Oh, I'd love to be an Oscar Mayer wiener.
As much as the company was known for its hot dogs, it was equally famous for its innovative marketing.
Say, what you making? Sandwiches, real He-Man sandwiches.
Perhaps its most memorable campaign was launched in 1936, when Oscar Mayer's nephew, Carl, created the Wienermobile.
Look, little Oscar.
For 5 decades, the giant hot dog on wheels was piloted across the country by Little Oscar.
Little Oscar, the world's smallest chef.
Today, there are 6 Wienermobiles driven by hot doggers, recent college grads who spend a year traveling the country in a 27-foot-long hot dog.
Do you guys like a wiener whistle?
And of course, they're still handing out that other Oscar Mayer icon, the wiener whistle. Oscar Mayer may get the fame and glory on the national stage, but here in Chicago, our hometown favorite hot dog is Vienna beef. The company got its start at Chicago's 1893 World's Fair, where a couple of Jewish immigrants from Austria-Hungary unveiled a special sausage recipe.
They would have been all beef, because the people who ran Vienna were, of course, Jews, and Jews don't eat pork.
Today, the recipe is essentially the same. Vienna makes its dogs at this state-of-the-art facility on the north side. They start by trimming briskets. The fatty part of the brisket goes in the hot dog, but it's mixed with lean bull meat so it all balances out. Both are ground up. Then they're mixed with a secret blend of spices. At that point, the hot dog's a kind of paste, which gets shot out of this machine into a casing. These skinless dogs are temporarily encased in blue plastic. Others are encased in natural casings. That's a polite word for sheep intestines. And finally, they're cooked in the smokehouse. Vienna beef may be responsible for making the hot dog itself delicious, but it's all of those toppings that make the Chicago hot dog unique. This was the contribution of the city's peddlers. After World War I, they started selling hot dogs in Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods. To make the German sausage a bit more familiar to the locals, they added the different vegetables that each ethnic group knew and loved.
Well, the sausage is German-Jewish. It has relish, which is probably Mediterranean. The pickles are German, tomato, Mediterranean. The hot pepper, which you find in Italian places, also Greek. And I like to think that it might be Mexican.
But needless to say, there's one taboo ingredient that must never appear on a true Chicago hot dog.
Ketchup has a flavor that's acidic, and it goes against the flavor of the meat.
This garden on a bun, as it's been called, really took off during the Depression. When money was tight, Chicagoans realized they could get their meat, bread, and veggies all for about 5 cents. And Vienna beef helped unemployed entrepreneurs cash in on the Chicago hot dog craze by building them bare-bones hot dog stands.
The hot dog stands in the early 30s were shanties, and they really were pieces of wood nailed together, and somebody had a great big bucket that he boiled water in, and he would take his buns and he'd put it on top of the boiling water.
Today, there are about 1,800 hot dog stands in Chicago. More locations than McDonald's, Burger King's, and Wendy's combined.
The quickest way to start an argument amongst Chicagoans is to ask, what's your favorite hot dog stand? And they all argue, it's the one I grew up with. Or the one I grew up with, which has been sold and now it's not any good.
You'll find the same Chicago hot dog on the north side, the south side, the west side, and in the suburbs. Its ingredients are German, Jewish, Italian, and Greek. When you think about it, the Chicago hot dog is more than just a sandwich. It's a metaphor for our city. People have come to Chicago from literally every corner of the earth. All of them contributing their own ingredients. And they've blended together here to give our city a flavor like none other.